How does it feel to be discarded by the people who gave you life? Tossed out like defective merchandise to protect their golden child 17 years ago. They shoved me into the state foster system with a perfectly manufactured lie about a delusional, broken girl. They thought they had buried the problem forever. They never imagined the trash they threw away would one day orchestrate the live, primetime broadcast of their absolute destruction. Hello to the wonderful audience of Maya Revenge Stories. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely disabled our monetization, leaving us without a budget to keep operating. If you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our hardworking team to cover their living expenses and continue bringing you these creations. You can easily donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on the screen or by clicking the PayPal link in the description or the comments section of this video. My name is Peyton Knight. At 29 years old, I am the executive producer and lead anchor of Pinnacle Media Group. I built this media empire with my bare hands, laying every brick myself after aging out of the foster care system. Today, my face is plastered on billboards across Times Square, and my voice commands the attention of millions. But the polished veneer of success you see on television was forged in a very specific, very cold kind of fire. To understand the woman I am, you have to understand the ghosts of the Knight family mansion in Boston. Growing up, the air in that house was always stifling, thick with the intoxicating scent of expensive perfume, old money, and desperate ambition. My parents, Richard and Eleanor Knight, were fanatics. They worshipped at the altar of high society and absolute political power. Their ultimate goal was a seat in the United States Senate, and every breath they took, every charity gala they hosted, was a calculated move on that grand chessboard. In their grand design, there was only room for one perfect heir. That was my twin sister, Haley. Haley was their obedient little angel, a flawless porcelain doll manufactured for the flashbulbs of the press. They poured every ounce of their supposed love and limitless wealth into her. She smiled perfectly, she spoke perfectly, and she never dared to look beneath the surface of the glittering life we were handed. I, on the other hand, was the shadow in the corner of the portrait. I was too observant, too quiet, and terribly cursed with a mind that demanded the truth. The breaking point arrived the year we turned 12. The mansion was buzzing with frantic preparations for Richard's preliminary campaign gala. Seeking refuge from the noise, I retreated to the one place I was strictly forbidden to enter, which was my father's mahogany-paneled study. I was only looking for a quiet corner to read, but a misaligned drawer in his heavy antique desk caught my attention. Inside, locked away from the public eye, I found the ugly truth hidden beneath layers of charitable tax forms. It was a massive insider trading operation. My father was using our family's highly publicized philanthropic foundation as a front to wash millions of dollars in illegal stock market gains. At 12 years old, I might not have understood the complex financial jargon of Wall Street, but I understood the ledgers. I understood the lists of offshore accounts and the fake recipient names. I knew exactly what a federal crime looked like. When I confronted them with the documents, expecting some sort of explanation or perhaps a desperate plea for secrecy, I witnessed the true, monstrous nature of Richard and Eleanor. They did not panic. They did not apologize or beg for my silence. Instead, they looked at me not as a daughter, but as a catastrophic leak. I was a liability that needed to be permanently plugged. Overnight, a meticulously crafted narrative was spun around my existence. The parents who had ignored me for a decade suddenly took a deep, tragic interest in my mental health. They brought in high-priced private psychiatrists who were all too willing to sign off on a diagnosis that conveniently fit the family's needs. I was brutally branded as a severely delusional child, suffering from oppositional defiant disorder. They told everyone in their elite circle that I was prone to fabricating vicious lies to seek attention, completely invalidating any word that might ever escape my mouth. The final act of their betrayal was executed with chilling corporate precision. It happened on the exact day Haley and I turned 12. There was a massive, catered party in the sunlit gardens for my twin. complete with string quartets and photographers documenting the perfect, happy family. I was not allowed outside. Inside the cold, silent library, there was no birthday cake for me. There were no tears, no tight embraces, no heartfelt apologies. There was only a stern-faced social worker and a thick stack of legal documents. Richard and Eleanor sat across from me, their expressions as unyielding as marble, and signed away their parental rights with the same casual indifference one might use to sign a grocery receipt. "It is for the best, Peyton," Eleanor had said, her voice completely devoid of any maternal warmth. "You need professional help that we simply cannot provide." That was the lie she told the state. The truth was that I was being thrown into the brutal labyrinth of the state foster care system for one singular reason. I was being discarded to protect my father's brilliant political future and to ensure that Haley's reputation remained untarnished. They erased me from their lives, confident that a discarded, mentally unstable foster kid could never pose a threat to the almighty Knight legacy. They were completely wrong. The trailer for my new investigative docuseries dropped at exactly 8 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, by noon. My face was dominating a massive digital billboard right in the center of Times Square. I was wearing a blood-red blazer, my arms crossed, staring down at the city with eyes that promised ruin. The series was billed as a ruthless deep dive into corporate corruption, and the entire nation was holding its breath. I had the power to make or break empires with a single primetime slot. Meanwhile, across the state, the Grand Knight Empire was suffocating under the weight of its own rot. Richard's latest Senate campaign was bleeding cash at an alarming rate, and their hidden offshore debts were finally catching up to them. The situation had grown exponentially worse thanks to my darling sister's husband. Haley had married Julian Vance, a man parading around Silicon Valley as a visionary tech billionaire. In reality, Julian was a desperate fraud. His much-hyped green energy startup was nothing more than a hollow shell game, a massive Ponzi scheme dressed up in eco-friendly buzzwords. He had promised investors revolutionary solar technology, but delivered nothing but fabricated progress reports. Now, his ruthless creditors were closing in, tightening the noose around his neck and threatening to drag the entire Knight family down into a catastrophic public bankruptcy. Desperation has a distinct, foul odor, and it did not take long for it to drift into my Manhattan office. They saw the billboards. They realized the delusional, discarded child they had thrown away was now the untouchable media mogul holding the keys to the kingdom. My executive assistant walked into my office on a Thursday afternoon, looking incredibly confused. She told me a woman claiming to be my mother was on line 1, sobbing uncontrollably. Eleanor had actually called the main switchboard of Pinnacle Media Group, putting on an Oscar-worthy performance of a devastated, heartbroken mother desperately begging to reconnect with her lost flesh and blood. I did not take the call. Instead, I had my assistant schedule a dinner for the following evening. I chose Le Jardin Blanc, an exclusive, notoriously expensive private restaurant in the Upper East Side, where the tasting menu alone costs a small fortune and privacy is guaranteed by heavily armed security at the door. I arrived early and watched them walk in. Eleanor was draped in vintage Chanel, and Richard wore a custom Italian suit, but beneath the silk and tailored wool, they looked incredibly hollow. Their eyes darted around the room, assessing the wealth, calculating their odds of survival. When Eleanor saw me, she practically threw herself across the private dining room. "My beautiful girl," Eleanor gasped, her voice trembling with perfectly calibrated theatrical agony as she reached across the crisp linen tablecloth to grasp my hands. "Look at you. We have spent 17 agonizing years looking for you. We hired private investigators. We scoured every agency. Our hearts have been bleeding every single day since we lost you." "It was a terrible mistake, Peyton," Richard chimed in, adopting his best somber politician face, nodding gravely. "We were misled by those awful doctors. We thought we were doing what was medically necessary. You have no idea the hell we have lived through, completely unaware of the magnificent, brilliant woman you were becoming." They stroked my ego with sickeningly sweet praises, complimenting my network, my poise, and my undeniable success. It was a masterclass in absolute hypocrisy. They thought I was the exact same vulnerable child they had abandoned, still craving their validation. They honestly believed I would eagerly swallow their pathetic lies if it meant finally sitting at the adult table. I did not throw my wine in their faces. I did not scream or demand an apology for the childhood they violently stole from me. I just sat there, swirling my ridiculously expensive sparkling water, and offered them a warm, gentle smile. I let them finish their pathetic performance before I leaned in, lowering my voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "I understand," I said smoothly, letting my voice drip with manufactured empathy. "The past is the past. What matters is right now. I know about the financial strain. Richard, I know about Julian and his angry investors. I know you are drowning in exactly $5 million of immediate toxic debt." Richard choked on his breath, his face turning an ashen shade of gray, while Eleanor froze completely, her heavily manicured fingers trembling against her crystal water glass. "Do not panic," I continued, keeping my tone light and deeply reassuring. "I am not here to judge. In fact, I am here to help. I am willing to quietly buy out that entire $5 million debt. I will clear Julian's ledgers entirely and stabilize your campaign funds by tomorrow morning. I will save this family." Eleanor stared at me, her eyes wide with greedy disbelief. "You would really do that for us, after everything that has happened?" "Family is family," I replied, flashing a flawless, utterly dead smile. "I only have one small condition. I am hosting a primetime television special this Friday night. I want the four of you, Richard, Haley, and Julian. I want you all sitting on my stage, live on national television, for an exclusive, uninterrupted interview. We will talk about reconciliation, the enduring power of family bonds, and we will remind the voters exactly what kind of strong, resilient man Richard Knight truly is." They practically tripped over themselves to agree. They saw a massive lifeline, a magical $5 million bailout wrapped in a blanket of free, primetime political advertising. They were so blinded by their own greed that they did not realize they had just enthusiastically accepted a formal invitation to their own public execution. Less than 24 hours before we were scheduled to go live to millions of households, the heavy glass doors of my executive suite were violently shoved open. My assistant protested outside, but she was easily brushed aside by a wave of pure, unfiltered entitlement. It was my twin sister, Haley, accompanied by her fraudulent husband, Julian Vance. Haley strutted in as if she owned the entire skyscraper. She wore a tailored white designer suit, her posture rigid with an arrogant grace she had spent years perfecting. Julian followed closely behind her, reeking of expensive cologne and desperate overcompensation. He walked with a wide, swaggering gait, his chest puffed out, attempting to project the aura of an untouchable titan of industry rather than a man standing on the terrifying edge of total ruin. The atmosphere in the room instantly became thick and suffocating. Without a single word of greeting, Julian marched directly to my custom glass desk. He reached inside his tailored jacket and slammed a thick legal document down on the pristine surface, followed immediately by a heavy, embossed piece of paper. It was a cashier's check made out to me for exactly $2 million. "Consider this an insurance policy." "Peyton," Julian sneered, leaning heavily over my desk to invade my personal space, trying to establish physical dominance. "That is a highly restrictive non-disclosure agreement. It legally binds you from bringing up my green energy startup, and it absolutely forbids any probing questions regarding the internal financial structuring of the Knight family or my corporate holdings during the broadcast. You deviate from the approved, family-friendly script, and I will sue you and this network for every single dime you have ever made in your miserable life." Haley stepped forward, her eyes narrowing as she looked down at me. The hatred in her gaze was palpable, a stark and ugly contrast to the angelic persona she wore for the cameras. "Let us be perfectly clear about what is happening here," Haley hissed, her voice dripping with pure venom. "You might have your little television show, and you might have scraped together some money, but deep down you are still just that desperate, pathetic little shadow begging for our parents to look at her. You are a clinger starved for affection. Peyton, you always have been. So, take the $2 million, smile for the cameras, read your lines, and be a good, quiet little background prop while I shine. Do not ruin my family's moment just because you are jealous." The silence in the room stretched out, tense and heavy. They stood there, practically vibrating with aggressive energy, waiting for me to explode. They wanted a fight. They wanted me to scream, to reject the money, to tear the contract into pieces so they could prove to themselves that I was still the unstable, defiant child they had written off 17 years ago. Instead, I let out a soft, genuine laugh. I reached for the solid gold fountain pen resting on my desk. I uncapped it smoothly, pulled the thick non-disclosure agreement toward me, and flipped directly to the very last page, without a single word of protest, without a second of hesitation or an ounce of negotiation. I signed my name on the dotted line. I pushed the signed contract and the $2 million check back across the glass desk. Julian blinked, his jaw dropping slightly, momentarily stunned by how effortlessly he had just won. Haley looked confused for a fraction of a second, but that confusion was quickly swallowed by a deeply sickening, smug satisfaction. She let out a short, triumphant scoff and snatched the contract off the desk. "Smart girl," Haley mocked, turning on her heel with a dramatic flip of her perfect hair. "See you under the lights, sister." They marched out of the office, their victory absolute in their own arrogant minds. I waited until the heavy glass doors clicked firmly shut, sealing me back in complete silence. The soft, accommodating smile vanished from my face instantly, replaced by a cold, calculating focus. I turned to my computer monitors. My fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing the standard production software and opening a highly secured, encrypted terminal that my floor directors could not even see. I executed a command override, transferring the entire teleprompter script and total control of the master audio board away from the central control room. I handed the digital keys over to a designated special guest, someone entirely hidden from the official production manifests and network security logs. Julian Vance might have thought he was a strategic genius, but his expensive lawyers had made a fatal, structural error. A non-disclosure agreement is fundamentally a bilateral contract. It legally gagged me, Peyton Knight, from making defamatory statements or initiating questions about his fraudulent startup. It successfully bound my mouth. However, it held absolutely zero legal weight, zero jurisdiction, and zero power to prevent a third-party, fully credentialed federal government official from walking onto my stage and presenting declassified, unsealed federal indictments directly to the American public. I had just sold them a false sense of security, and tomorrow night, I was going to use it to bury them all alive. The atmosphere backstage at Pinnacle Media Group was pulled tight, humming with the electric, terrifying energy that only live television can produce. Tens of millions of Americans were sitting in their living rooms, their eyes glued to their screens, waiting for the heavily promoted, tear-jerking family reunion of the decade. The studio floors were a chaotic ballet of floor directors, sound engineers, and makeup artists frantically ensuring every single detail was flawless. 30 minutes before we went on air, my dressing room door swung open. Eleanor slipped inside, clutching a garment bag like a shield. She unzipped it to reveal a fragile, incredibly plain white dress, the kind of garment designed to make a woman look soft, vulnerable, and completely non-threatening. "Peyton, darling," Eleanor cooed, her eyes pleading with a sickening sweetness. "I thought this would be perfect for tonight. It is so pure. It projects a certain humility. You know it will show the audience that you are truly sorry for the past, that you are just a humble girl finding her way back to her loving family." I looked at the white fabric, then up at Eleanor's desperate, calculating face. She wanted me to look pitiful. She wanted the visual narrative to clearly establish her and Richard as the benevolent saviors, welcoming home their broken, apologetic prodigal daughter. I did not say a word. I simply stepped past her and signaled my wardrobe assistant. When the final countdown began and the stage manager called my name, I did not walk out in her pathetic white dress. I strode onto the polished stage floor wearing a razor-sharp, dark crimson power suit. The deep red fabric absorbed the intense studio lights, commanding absolute authority and completely overwhelming the visual space. I looked exactly like what I was, which was the executioner. The applause sign flashed red. The studio audience erupted into a deafening roar as the broadcast went live across the nation. I took my seat in the center chair, directly opposite the sprawling, plush leather sofa where the Knight family sat arranged like American royalty. Richard and Eleanor held hands, projecting deep, enduring strength. Haley sat with her legs perfectly crossed, a picture of angelic grace, while Julian rested his arm protectively behind her, wearing his absolute best billionaire smirk. For the first 20 minutes, I played my part to absolute perfection. I completely honored the boundaries of Julian's non-disclosure agreement. I kept my posture relaxed, my voice soft and inviting. I served them the easiest, most painfully sweet questions imaginable, laying down a soft runway for them to take flight on their own massive egos. Richard and Eleanor eagerly took the bait, looking directly into camera 3. My father squeezed out actual, shimmering tears. He delivered a masterful, heartbreaking monologue about the sheer agony of waking up to find his rebellious, emotionally troubled teenage daughter had simply vanished into the night. Eleanor leaned her head on his shoulder, dabbing at her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief, painting them both as the ultimate martyrs who had sacrificed their own peace of mind while leaving the door open for my return. "We never gave up hope," Richard declared, his baritone voice trembling with rehearsed emotion. "Every single day, we prayed our lost girl would find her way out of the darkness and back into our arms." I nodded sympathetically, turning the spotlight smoothly over to my sister and her husband. I asked them how they managed to stay so strong through the family tragedy. Julian eagerly seized the microphone, using the emotional momentum to pivot directly to his businesses, protected by the ironclad shield of his contract. He boldly sang the praises of his green energy startup, boasting about the millions of hypothetical watts of power his charitable foundation was preparing to deliver to impoverished communities. He painted himself as a visionary philanthropist, entirely unchallenged, basking in the warm, blinding glow of national adoration. The studio audience was completely captivated. I could hear soft sniffles from the front row as people dabbed their eyes, entirely consumed by the beautiful, fabricated illusion of healing and forgiveness. The Knights were visibly glowing, their postures relaxing as they mentally declared total victory. They had survived. They had won over the public, secured their political future, and silenced me on my own stage. That was exactly when I decided the play was over. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, and the soft, accommodating smile vanished from my face. The subtle shift in my body language was enough to make the control room completely cut the background music. The sudden, dead silence in the massive studio was deafening. I looked directly at Richard, my eyes turning as cold and hard as the camera lens pointed at us. "That is a truly beautiful story, Richard," I said, my voice dropping an octave, completely devoid of any previous warmth. "The sleepless nights, the endless searching, it paints a magnificent picture of unconditional love." Haley shifted uncomfortably on the couch, her flawless smile faltering for a fraction of a second. Julian's hand tightened around his wife's shoulder. They could feel the atmospheric pressure in the room plummeting. "However," I continued, my voice ringing out with crystal clarity across the silent studio, "to truly bear witness to this magnificent, unwavering love, I think it is only fair that we hear from another perspective. Let us welcome the person who, on behalf of the government, actually witnessed my disappearance 17 years ago." The massive soundproof doors at the back of the stage parted heavily, the rhythmic, Commanding click of sharp heels echoed across the completely silent studio floor. Out of the shadows walked Evelyn Thorne. She did not look like a soft, comforting woman stepping into a heartwarming family reunion. She looked like an apex predator entering an arena. 17 years ago. Evelyn was the exhausted state social worker assigned to process my intake on the absolute darkest night of my life, today. She was a terrifying force of nature, serving as a notoriously ruthless federal prosecutor for the United States Department of Justice. Most importantly, she was the woman who had formally adopted me. She was my real mother. Evelyn bypassed the guest chairs entirely. She marched directly to the low crystal coffee table positioned between my chair and the knight's plush sofa. She was not carrying a box of tissues to wipe away tears, nor did she hold a diary filled with sad childhood memories. In her right hand, she gripped a thick legal dossier stamped with the unmistakable, bright red seal of the federal government. Without a single word of greeting, she slammed the heavy file down onto the glass. The resounding crack echoed violently through the highly sensitive studio microphones, causing the live audience to physically jump in their seats. "There was no runaway teenager," Evelyn announced, her voice ringing out with the absolute, uncompromising authority of a federal judge. "There were no sleepless nights. There was no desperate search." She flipped the heavy cover open and extracted a perfectly preserved, yellowing document. What I hold in my hand is the official, notarized state record of the voluntary relinquishment of parental rights. Evelyn declared. She held the paper up, ensuring the closest sweeping camera could zoom in on the ink. "It is signed by Richard Knight and Eleanor Knight. It is dated on the exact day of Peyton's 12th birthday. You did not lose a troubled child to the streets. You legally threw her away like garbage to protect a criminal enterprise." The collective gasp from the live studio audience completely sucked the oxygen out of the room. The beautiful, tragic narrative the Knights had just spun was brutally shattered into a million jagged pieces. Eleanor let out a strangled, breathless sound, clapping a shaking hand over her mouth as the color completely drained from her heavily contoured face. Richard reacted exactly like a cornered animal, the polished veneer of the grieving, benevolent politician instantly melted away, replaced by ugly, raw panic. He leaped up from the leather sofa, his face turning an angry, blotchy shade of purple. "This is an absolute outrage," Richard bellowed, pointing a violently shaking finger at me. "This is a fabricated ambush. I demand you cut the cameras immediately. This woman is a liar, and these documents are completely forged." Evelyn did not even blink. She did not argue with a desperate man. Instead, she looked up toward the tinted glass windows of the control room. Because I had securely transferred complete administrative control of the broadcast to her authority, she did not need my permission to execute the next strike. "Play Exhibit A," Evelyn commanded. The studio audio system hissed for a fraction of a second. Then, a grainy, undeniable voice blasted through the overhead speakers. It was an old audio tape, a clandestine recording seized from the private files of the corrupt psychiatrist they had paid off all those years ago. The voice belonged to Richard Knight, stripped of all its public polish. He sounded cold, calculating, and utterly ruthless. "She knows way too much about the cash flow." Richard's recorded voice snarled through the speakers, bouncing off the studio walls. "The girl was digging in my private desk. She saw the offshore transfer ledgers. Get rid of her before she destroys my entire career. I do not care what diagnosis you have to write down. Just get her out of my house." The recording clicked off. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and entirely apocalyptic. Tens of millions of viewers across the country had just heard a prominent candidate for the United States Senate confess to orchestrating a fraudulent medical diagnosis to cover up massive financial crimes. Beside Richard, the illusion of the perfect family was completely imploding. Haley was hyperventilating, her chest heaving as her flawless facade cracked down the middle. Her perfectly manicured hands clawed at her own designer dress. She saw the glittering empire burning to ashes around her, and her only instinct was absolute, selfish survival. She lunged forward, physically ripping the clip-on microphone off Julian's lapel and clutching it tightly to her mouth. "It was them!" Haley shrieked, her voice shrill and hysterical, completely destroying her carefully crafted angelic persona. "I had absolutely nothing to do with the offshore accounts. They made me lie. They told me if we got rid of her, I would get 100% of the trust fund and all the inheritance. I just kept quiet so they would not throw me out too. Do not look at me like that. It was all their fault." In her blind, desperate panic to distance herself from the sinking ship, the Golden Child had just proudly admitted to being a willing accomplice. She had known the entire time. She had happily watched her twin sister be dragged away to state custody, coldly calculating her own financial gain while smiling for the family holiday cards. She stood there, trembling and completely exposed, having just broadcasted the rotten core of her soul to the entire world. Julian Vance finally realized the terrifying gravity of the situation. The smug, billionaire tech mogul facade completely evaporated, leaving behind a frantic, cornered con artist. He leaped off the plush leather sofa, his face contorted in absolute rage, waving his arms wildly at the ceiling. "Cut the feed!" Julian screamed, his voice cracking hysterically as he desperately searched for the floor director. "Turn off those cameras right now, director. Cut the broadcast, or I will sue this entire network into absolute oblivion." He spun around to face me, his eyes wide and bloodshot, pointing a violently trembling finger directly at my chest. "You signed a non-disclosure agreement this morning," Julian yelled, spit flying from his lips. $2 million. Peyton, you signed it in your own office. I am going to drag you through federal court until you are completely bankrupt. You breached the contract. I slowly stood up from my center chair. I did not raise my voice. I did not match his frantic, sweaty panic. I simply looked at him with a cold, absolute calm that seemed to terrify him even more. I adjusted the lapel of my crimson suit and offered a chilling, victorious smile directly to the main camera, addressing the tens of millions of people watching at home as much as the pathetic men sweating on my stage. "That is the fundamental problem with arrogance, Julian," I said, my voice cutting through the chaotic studio like a sharpened blade. "It completely blinds you to the obvious. I did not breach a single clause of your desperately drafted contract. The paper I signed explicitly prevented me from personally investigating your fraudulent green energy startup. However, it had absolutely no legal jurisdiction over Evelyn Thorne. I did not investigate you tonight. I simply yielded my platform to an ongoing, meticulously scheduled federal investigation conducted by the United States Department of Justice." Richard was practically hyperventilating now, clutching his chest as he sank back onto the couch. "You set us up," Richard wheezed, his brilliant political career flashing before his eyes in a horrific blaze. "You offered us $5 million to pay off the debt." I laughed softly, a sound completely devoid of any warmth or humor. "Ah, yes, the $5 million bailout. Did you honestly believe I was feeling charitable? You see, the Justice Department had a massive logistical problem. They knew all about your phantom accounts. They knew about the intricate web of offshore shell companies you used to launder money for Julian's imaginary solar panels, but they could not definitively prove that you, Richard Knight, and you, Julian Vance, were the ultimate beneficiaries controlling those specific anonymous accounts, until tonight." I paused, letting the crushing weight of reality settle over them like a concrete block. "By enthusiastically agreeing to accept a $5 million debt transfer into those exact routing numbers, and by openly confirming your desperate financial state here, live on national television, you both just publicly validated your legal ownership of the greatest money laundering network on the East Coast. That was not a family bailout. That was a carefully constructed bait, and it was the final piece of evidence required for a federal grand jury indictment." Right on cue, the heavy reinforced double doors at the main entrance of the studio were violently smashed open. The sound was like an explosion, echoing off the high ceilings. A swarm of federal agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation poured onto the soundstage. They wore dark tactical gear, their gold badges gleaming fiercely under the harsh studio lights. Richard Knight and Julian Vance, Stay exactly where you are. Keep your hands where we can see them, the lead agent commanded, his voice booming over the studio audio system. The entire nation watched in stunned, breathless silence as the untouchable, elite pillars of Boston society were roughly shoved against the edge of the plush sofa. The metallic, unforgiving click of heavy handcuffs echoed loudly through the highly sensitive lapel microphones. Richard tried to hide his face from the swooping cameras, thoroughly humiliated, while Julian openly wept, sobbing uncontrollably as an agent coldly read him his Miranda rights right there on the illuminated stage. The Grand Knight Empire was dead. It had collapsed completely and publicly. Beside the shattered remnants of her family, my twin sister fell to her knees. Haley collapsed onto the pristine glass floor, her perfect, regal posture entirely destroyed. The flawless, angelic mask she had worn for 29 years was shattered beyond repair. Heavy, black mascara ran in ugly, thick streaks down her pale cheeks, ruining her expensive white designer dress. She crawled toward me, grabbing desperately at the air. "Peyton, please," Haley wailed, her voice a pathetic, high-pitched screech. "Tell them I did not know. Tell them to leave me alone. Please, you are my sister. You have to save me." I looked down at the woman who had happily stolen my life, who had mocked my need for love, who had laughed at my exile just hours ago. I did not feel pity. I did not feel a shred of anger. I felt absolutely nothing. I took one deliberate, calm step backward, ensuring her desperately flailing, tear-stained hands did not smear her ruined makeup onto my pristine crimson suit. "We are not family, Haley," I said softly, turning my face away from her hysterical sobbing. I turned my back on the wreckage of my biological family, Evelyn Thorne, the woman who had actually saved me, the mother who had given me a real home and taught me how to fight. Stepped forward. I linked my arm tightly through hers. Together, we walked away from the screaming, the pathetic crying, and the complete, absolute destruction of the Knight legacy. We strode confidently past the frantic camera crews, moving toward the exit as the blinding flashes of press cameras began to detonate outside the studio doors, mixing with the piercing wail of approaching police sirens. I left the suffocating, rotten past behind me on that stage. As the heavy studio doors closed behind us, I smiled. I stepped out into the crisp night air, ready to embrace a brilliant, unburdened future that belonged entirely to me. The television screen abruptly cut to black. Thank you so much to everyone for listening to this incredible story today. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please drop your city or country in the comments below. If you found today's story engaging and satisfying, please consider helping our channel with a donation of just $1. Your support ensures our dedicated team can feed their families and keep producing the best revenge stories on the internet. You can easily contribute by scanning the PayPal QR code on the screen or by clicking the PayPal link provided in the description or the pinned comment. Thank you from the bottom of my heart, and I will see you in the next video.